Hi guys, so I'm Sosan. This lecture here is essentially an introduction to something called revalidation and continuing professional development. You do have obviously this one lecture, and then next week it's going to be followed up by a workshop, and there's pre-work that you have to do prior to the workshop next week, but I'll talk about that at the end of this lecture. Learning outcomes, hopefully by the end you will be able to know what the requirements are when it comes to revalidation, and these are set out by the General Pharmaceutical Council, the GPHC. Hopefully you'll have an understanding of CPD, so continuing professional development, and really understand the reason why CPD exists, but also why CPD is beneficial to yourself and also on a wider context to your employer and to the NHS. Hopefully you'll be able to know what the requirements are from the GPHC when it comes to continued professional development and revalidation. And also hopefully by the end you'll have an idea on how to complete a CPD record, and very specifically an unplanned CPD record. Right, the General Pharmaceutical Council, hopefully you guys know this by now. They are the independent regulator for pharmacists, pharmacy technicians and registered pharmacies, and this covers England, Wales and Scotland. Most healthcare professionals have independent regulators. So for example, the medics have the General Medical Council, the GMC. Nurses and midwives have the NMC, Nursing and Midwifery Council, and we have the GPHC. This is very much to give you an idea of the timeline of CPD when it comes to pharmacy. Essentially, we had the Royal Pharmaceutical Society of Great Britain way back when, and they made in 2005 CPD mandatory for pharmacists, and they wouldn't want to see it. You just have to declare every single year that you've done it, you've completed your CPD entries. They then made it mandatory for pharmacists and pharmacy technicians, but then in 2010 the GPHC replaced the Royal Pharmaceutical Society of Great Britain, and they set the standards for CPD. Then they set the framework for CPD, and in 2008 the whole thing, they overturned the whole thing and called it revalidation, and we're going to talk about what revalidation is now. Revalidation is essentially one of the ways in which the General Pharmaceutical Council works with us, so the pharmacy professionals, and it's a way to make sure that we remain fit to practice. And the methods they use is all around developing and maintaining our professional knowledge, but also our attitudes and behaviours. Revalidation is all your revalidation entries, which we'll go on to later, are reviewed by a pharmacy professional and a lay person, and you get tailored feedback based on your entries, but also aggregate feedback overall. Essentially, it's compulsory to complete your revalidation entries in order to remain on the General Pharmaceutical Register. So for myself, to continuing practicing as a pharmacist, I have to be on the pharmacist register. But to maintain myself as being on the pharmacy register, not only do I have to pay money every single year to maintain that registration, but I also need to submit various things that count for revalidation, and we'll go on to what those various things are. But essentially, if I fail to do this, then I could risk being thrown off the register and not having a license to practice. The reason why revalidation exists is essentially just to assure patients and the public that us as pharmacy professionals are safe, we're effective after we register. So if you think about it, you guys are undergrads at the moment, and when you graduate, you have to remember that from the point of graduation, things are constantly changing. So new drugs are constantly coming out, new discoveries are constantly being made. old drugs are being licensed for new indications, and things change. I mean, since I graduated, things have developed. So it's really important that for ourselves and for the patients and the public, we stay up to date with all these things that are developing and updating and changing. Um, it's also a way to ensure that we're fit to practice, because obviously if us as pharmacy professionals are not up to date with any knowledge, any new knowledge that's coming out, we are essentially not very fit to practice, because it means that actually we are not providing our patients and the public with the most up-to-date service and treatments that we could possibly be providing. So not only are we maintaining and developing our professional knowledge, but also it's really important that we continue to develop and maintain our attitudes and our behaviours. It's also really good because it really encourages pharmacy professionals to really reflect on their learning and their practice. And quite often, if you lack or if you don't reflect, you're not really going to be able to progress further. You have to start developing these abilities to reflect on your practice and identifying what you need to work on more, whether it's knowledge or your behaviours or your attitudes or any other skills that are relevant to pharmacy. And it really also focuses on the outcomes for those using our services, which is quite often patients. And like I said, it's very much compulsory. So revalidation has to be done every year in order to remain on the GPHC register. In terms of once you graduate, so this is not right now, once you graduate, all of these entries, the revalidation entries, which we'll go on to on the next slide, are done via the GPHC online portal. And essentially everyone has their own personal login once you qualify. But it's also really important to almost keep a written portfolio or something that that supports of evidence that supports your entry. So whether that's certificates or anything that you claim in your entries, you might want to keep a spare copy of evidence just in case the GPHC requests it once you submit it. Right, so revalidation requirements. So we've talked about what revalidation is in the sense of keeping yourselves up to date and assuring the public that you're fit to practice. But you guys need to know what you actually need to do in order to prove that. So the things that the GPHC asks of us is to complete various records. Okay, so every year we have to complete various records, and this is what constitutes revalidation. So these records include one peer discussion, and we'll go on to what each of these mean a little bit later. So one peer discussion has to be submitted every single year. One reflective account has to be submitted every single year, and 4 continuing professional development records need to be submitted every single year. And again, we'll discuss in detail what each of these mean a little bit later on. But essentially, this is what revalidation is. So these entries are what revalidation is, and this should hopefully represent you keeping your knowledge, attitudes, and behaviours up to date. It's really important that when you complete those entries that we talked about earlier, that they're really relevant to the safe and effective practice of pharmacy. So when, for example, you're completing a reflective account, you have to make sure that it's relevant to pharmacy. It can't really be of any other pastime or any other hobbies that you have. So it really has to relate to the context of your practice, and it really has to also relate to activities that you have completed, and you have to give examples of the benefits you think that people using your service have had as a result of you completing this knowledge, or completing this new skill or new behaviour. As always, the record should be your own, so you can't really copy someone else's record or get inspiration from anyone else. And within these records that you submit, you cannot breach patient confidentiality. If you do that, then the GPHC will pick up on it, and you're breaking one of our codes of ethics. So you have to not mention patients or anything within them. So now we're going to go on to each of those requirements in a little bit more detail, just to give you guys a bit more of an idea. So, because I appreciate so far it's probably been a little bit woolly. So the very first one that we talked about, the very first annual requirement, is something called a peer review. And essentially, this is when you sit down with someone that you work with, so another colleague, who can give you really good constructive feedback on your work performance. So it doesn't have to be another pharmacist. It can be, it needs to be someone that knows you, that has an insight into your work and what you do, and also what is expected of you. But it can be anyone. So it can be a hospital doctor that you work closely with, it can be a nurse, it can be a GP, or another pharmacist. So for example, for me, I work really closely in a team within the hospital with various, a load of nurses, consultants and occupational therapists, and that is my team every single day I step foot in that hospital. Now, one of those individuals would be the most appropriate people, in my opinion, to do a peer review for me, because they see me working every single day, as opposed to a pharmacist that knows me but does not see me working every single day. The peer reviews involve discussions. So these discussions, really, it's best to have them face to face, but they can take place over the phone, via web chat, via video call. But it's really important that these discussions don't take place by email. So these peer reviews have to take place by any other means, just not email. And it's really around aiding your own development. So it's not about the other colleague that you're speaking to. They are just really providing you with constructive feedback. But the whole aim is to aid your development, which is why it's really important that within these discussions you are both open and honest. And personally, I would do these discussions with someone that I trust, really. I think it's really good because it encourages pharmacists to engage with other colleagues, and also it very much reduces any potential for professional isolation as well. So that's the first one. In terms of what the GPHC asks, when we're submitting our GPHC documents, there's 3 specific questions within the template for peer review. The very first one, we have to say why we chose our peer. So we have to describe the fact that this particular individual works with us every day. They've got a good insight. They're quite constructive. You have to say how the process of peer discussion has benefited your practice, but also how it's benefited those using your service. And more often than not, that relates to patients, and give examples. Okay. So those are the 3 questions in the template that the GPHC asks for with peer review. The second annual requirement, if you remember, for revalidation is submitting a reflective account. Now, this is really good because it really encourages you to think about your practice, but it's quite different to peer review. The way in which it's different to peer review is, number one, you're doing it alone. So you're not having a discussion with anyone else to discuss your progress and with the aim of your own development. But also the GPHC will ask you to reflect on very specific standards related to pharmacy professionals. So the next slide will remind you of what the pharmacy standards are. But essentially we have standards that we have to work towards. Okay, so there's 9 standards in total, and every single year the GPHC will choose 1, 2, 3, 4, however many standards every single year. And when they choose these specific standards, your reflective account should essentially be reflecting on how you have worked previously to represent these standards. So you have to be given examples on how you have worked against these standards. So these are our standards. So for example, there's person-centered care, there's professional judgment, speaking up about concerns. For example, in 2020, the GPHC might turn around, or 2021, the GPHC might turn around and say, right, everyone submitting their CPDs in 2021 has to write a reflective account to show and provide examples on how they have worked over the last year towards these three standards: leadership, effective communication, and professional behaviour. So the reflective account that you write is very specifically reflecting on the standards chosen by the GPHC. And the choice of standards that the GPHC will choose will change every single year, but it will always be out of these specific standards, because these are the standards for pharmacy professionals, unless they change or get updated in the future. Now, the last requirement of revalidation was something called CPD records. And this is really what we're going to go on to in more detail within this lecture. So remember that the requirement was 4 CPD records have to be submitted every single year as part of revalidation. Out of these 4, 2 of them have to be planned CPD records and 2 of them have to be unplanned CPD records. Now, these are the GPHC requirements for qualified pharmacy professionals. So a planned CPD record is essentially when you have decided to develop your knowledge or skills in advance, and you carry out multiple activities in order to achieve that. Okay, so you've identified a gap in your knowledge or a gap in your skill, and you're going to do multiple things to try to fill that gap. An unplanned CPD record is when something has happened, so whether it's an event has happened and you have learned something new that you weren't planning on learning in the first place. So for example, you might be on placement and you might overhear or sit in a consultation that a pharmacist is doing with a patient, and right there on the spot you have learned something new. You weren't planning on learning it, you just learnt it. Or you might have been flicking through the pharmaceutical journal and right there on the spot you learn something new. Now that is an unplanned learning activity. In terms of expectations from you guys this year, hopefully you guys remember the lecture of the PAD portfolio that you had from Dr. Bisley, Dr. Sam Bisley. The GPHC wants 4 records, but what we want of you this year is we want 6 unplanned CPDs for your PAD portfolio. So in second year, we'll focus on planned CPD. But in first year, we want you guys to write unplanned CPDs, and 6 of these in total. Now, I think this is possibly a good time to maybe take a break if you want to, and possibly have a look again at your student development portfolio, which is for your PAD portfolio, and just remind yourselves of the requirements for your PAD portfolio for first year, and very specifically the requirements for your PAD portfolio CPD entries for this year. So I'll just let you go off and do that, and when you come back to the next activity, we're going to talk into more detail over what CPD is.